So welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews number 10. And this time we're going to talk about Archie Shepp's album, The Magic of Juju, from 1967. And this is actually the original 1967 US release. So what to expect from this? Well, this is very much, or at least large portions of this are free jazz. And free jazz is not something about which most people are neutral. You love it or you hate it. That said, there are real differences between side 1 and side 2 here. Side 1 is very clearly a single piece of really quite dramatic free jazz. Side 2 has many more passages which are much more traditionally, I guess, accessible jazz. Archie Shepp is a tenor saxophonist. He's still alive, thankfully, and he's in his 80s now, I think. He was somebody who came along a few years after the period where Miles Davis and John Coltrane were and others of the kind of the post bebop period were rising to prominence, and he emerges on the scene in the very late 50s or the early 60s. And his first album, the first recordings he featured on were in, I think, 1962. Shepp was an avant-gardist from the start. He's not one of these folks like a lot of the other people who were in the avant-garde who started off playing, sort of bebop standards and then, began to experiment. From the very beginning, he was playing with Cecil Taylor, John Chichai, Don Cherry, and Coltrane took a real interest in him, and it can be argued that of the two, he is more influential in Coltrane than the other way around. That said, he certainly was respectful of Coltrane, and his first album on his released under his own name was basically a tribute album to Coltrane called 4 for Train, where he's mostly, not entirely, but mostly covering Coltrane songs, and has Coltrane on the cover, which to me suggests that he didn't lack confidence as a young saxophonist, essentially taking on the person who at that point, the music of the person who at that point was basically recognized as the most significant saxophonist, arguably in history. And Coltrane himself was a huge fan, as I mentioned. He referred to Shepp's music as a manifestation of the love of God. This is Coltrane in his more spiritual period. Shepp is quite a socially conscious person. He is at this stage, he is really immersed in African American self-determination, in ideas of well, certainly around, he's deeply invested in the Black Power movement, and he maintains a social consciousness all the way through the 70s as well. And his other this is probably one of his two best known records. The other one is 1972's Attica Blues, which is all about the prison riots of that particular year. He was quite critical of the moves that other African American jazz artists who had a lot of what you might call, critical credibility in the 60s, people like Pharoah Sanders and Herbie Hancock and others, of the moves that they made in the 1970s to become more palatable and more commercially acceptable. And as the clip I'm going to show you now here shows.
What are your thoughts on the transitional music that people like Herbie and Pharaoh and Norman Connors are getting into now?
Well, I'm not so sure that's transitional. I consider that reactionary music, and I don't mean it in a negative sense either. I mean, I think it's nostalgic in the sense that everybody's into the oldies but the goodies, I mean, everybody wants to look back to Bonnie and Clyde, to the 20s, to that syndrome. And why? I think everybody's nostalgic, or at least the culture's nostalgic, because it was at that time that Negroes were most oppressed, that black people had fewer rights. And that, you see, as our music metamorphosed into the 40s and 50s and 60s, I think it also developed along certain rational lines and scientific lines as well, which have never been investigated or really understood thoroughly by our people, which is why rock and roll and soul music, if you like, and all those terms, is very convenient, I think, for an establishment which seeks to regiment our people, to regularize their thoughts. It's because they are creating today a plantation of the mind.
So side 1, as I just mentioned, is occupied entirely with the title track, "The Magic of Juju." It starts with this very sort of, well, it's distinctively African sort of rhythm, drumming and percussion, and it's interesting because you have a sense of, you think where you think the song is going to go, this tune is going to go, but then Shepp comes in with just a blast of intense, free sax playing on his tenor, and his tone is amazing, and the intensity of what he's playing is just leaps out of the speakers, and he never lets up. Or certainly he doesn't let up for probably the first 16 minutes of this particular track. This is through some combination of the excellent production, through the imaginative and passionate and emotional playing from Shepp, through, I think, the very well paired accompaniment of the rhythm section. Somehow this works really, really well to be much more accessible than it ought to be. Now, to be clear, this is not dinner music jazz, right? This is not something that you're going to be able to do anything else to other than listen to it. But it is strangely accessible, as I mentioned, much more so than, say, Coltrane's Ascension, which is, an important record, but much harder to, I think, feel at ease with than this one. There are sort of Coltrane-esque sheets of sound, but it's very much Shepp's own sound here. There's no serious debt to Coltrane here. Eventually, after, as I say, about 60 minutes of this, the band begins to join in, the horns begin to join in, and there's a fade out, but you're left pretty emotionally drained by that, and not in a bad way. It's a real trip, and I encourage anybody who may feel skeptical about free jazz or be saying to themselves, well, this is not really my thing, or I've heard it before, I don't like it. I think I would suggest don't judge the whole genre until you have at least listened to this particular track, because it really is something else. Side 2, 3 tracks, one short, one medium size, and one longer. The first one is "You're What This Day Is All About," which begins oddly with an almost a fanfare, like an orchestra tuning up, and so you think you're in for something kind of discordant and unstructured, but then it moves to basically a slow bop with almost a New Orleans feel to it, particularly with the horn section, and it's all over in less than 2 minutes. A song called "Shazam," which again is bop, much like the third song on side 2 as well. Shazam has got some lovely playing by Michael Zverin, who's the primary of the 2 trumpeters who guest in this album, and Reggie Workman towards the end of the tune has a really nice little solo on bass. And then the album concludes with "Sorry About That," which has again a sort of bop intro, but then the free jazz of side 1 re-enters the album on this song, and you have an extended solo by Shepp. To me, I felt like this felt like an echo of side 1 as opposed to anything which stands in its own, and I also felt like the much sparer arrangement of the title track really served his soloing well. Not so much on this song, on "Sorry About That," and anyway, which is about 10 minutes, and that closes out the album. So what to say about "The Magic of Juju"? Well, there's no album really like this. It is one of the high points of free jazz, and really, as I mentioned earlier, the point of free jazz, if there is a point, is captured on side 1 here. It's beautifully produced by Bob Thiel, who was Impulse's top producer all the way pretty much through the 60s, well, certainly after Creed Taylor left. And I give this album 4.5 stars. The only reason I wouldn't give it 5 is that I think side 2 really lacks the impact of side 1, and it loses its way at times. The playing is good, but it's not up to the standard of the first side. But let's face it, nobody's going to buy this record because they're worried about the tracks on side 2. This is all about what's on side 1, which is an epic moment in the history of free jazz and an essential piece of listening for any jazz collector.